We are just over 2 months out from INC 5, what is meant to be the final negotiating session for the new Global Plastics Treaty. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to secure an ambitious, robust, and equitable treaty that is fit for purpose to end plastic pollution. So what we want to talk about today is the role of data in securing this success that everyone's working towards. Data, and specifically starting to unpack what some of the plastics data will be required to deliver on that UNEA resolution. It hasn't really been discussed much in the negotiating rooms. However, the availability of this data will be absolutely central to the future success of the treaty and the global regime that it creates. So our presentations today are going to be really focused on bringing data to the forefront of everyone's mind. And so we really want to explain and take the time to unpack the role of data on some of these key aspects of the treaty, reflecting back on sort of that initial UNEA resolution and what we're setting out to achieve. Provide some context, I think, on some of the challenges around the availability of data that most countries face, but also provide some ideas and steps that can be taken to ensure the treaty structure and core provisions likely to be agreed at INC 5 can really facilitate and encourage the comprehensive data on plastics that will really ensure a transparent, accountable, robust, and ambitious, but also equitable process that I think everyone is trying to achieve. So without further ado, I would like to introduce my two colleagues that will be presenting today. I also just want to acknowledge the contributions of other team members that form part of our team here at the Centre that very much are at the heart of this presentation and a lot of the thinking that went behind it. We have an amazing plastics economist, Helena Dickinson, and plastics data scientist, Bella Charlesworth. Our first presenter will be Jordan Gacutan, who's a senior research associate within the Centre. After Jordan, our second presenter will be Randika Jayasinghe, who is our plastics and waste specialist.
Ocean accounts organise relevant social, environmental, and economic data and statistics into a common framework, which is compatible with the structure of national accounts maintained by national statistical offices or ministries of finance around the world. In now more than 30 countries, ocean accounting systems are being developed for diverse reasons to enable governments and other stakeholders to measure progress towards growth and sustainability of the ocean economy, to track the status of marine ecosystems and how economic sectors depend on the health of those ecosystems, to inform designation of marine and coastal protected areas, establish rich multi-sector data structures for marine spatial planning, and/or to support the scaling and accountability of finance for sustainable ocean development. This is a lot of progress, and its pace is motivated by specific global commitments, such as the Global Biodiversity Framework, Sustainable Development Goals, in particular targets 15.9 and 17.19, and the transformations agreed by the heads of government represented on the high-level panel for a sustainable economy, to name a few. More practically, it's motivated by a growing awareness of the need to change the way we make decisions to build ocean economies that work for people and nature. And that requires new sources of well-structured information that goes beyond narrow metrics, focused solely on economic growth. Despite accelerating progress, ocean accounting for sustainable development remains at an early stage of development. It relies on continued innovation and sharing between decision makers and technical specialists across a broad range of thematic areas and disciplines, from data science, ecology, economics, public policy, and many others.
So, why accounting? Well, we have a lot of international commitments, sustainable development goals, Convention on Biological Diversity, that influences or is ratified into national legislation and policies. And in turn, those form goals and targets. So several countries have the protecting 30% by 2030, for example, from the Convention on Biological Diversity. And they implement these goals through frameworks such as marine spatial planning, marine protected areas, or the blue economy. Now, these approaches could also be guided by multiple frameworks as well, like nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based adaptation, or natural capital. To understand how we are progressing towards these goals and targets, we need indicators. Now, these indicators could be supported by environmental, economic, and social data that could be formed through accounts, organized rather through accounts, and then form the indicators we need. So you can see here, it's quite a range of data that is needed to form these indicators. Some countries are going even further and structuring their data into accounts, and accounts specifically guided by international standards. Having common definitions and concepts is critical to produce indicators, and the step before that, accounts. You may be familiar with the system of national accounts, which was formed back in 1958, and that was roughly 80 pages when it was first formed. And now it's over 800 pages, and it tells us how, or at least gives us guidance on, how to measure sectors and flows within the economy. Over 30 years of development, finally, we have in 2012 the SEA Central Framework, or the System of Environmental Economic Accounting, which gives us definitions and also concepts to measure specific flows in the economy and from the environment to the economy as well, in a way that we already do for economic accounts or national accounts, which are responsible for GDP. So that looks at how to account for and link the environment and natural resources to the economy. So thematic accounts such as water, energy, agriculture, forests, and fisheries. And more recently, we have ecosystem accounting. And this takes a spatial approach and looks at ecosystems as a whole and the services they provide. So ecosystem services. And we take these three standards and we take aspects and provide guidance for how do we do that kind of accounting for the ocean. The SEA Central Framework has over 90 countries that have implemented the standard. The ecosystem accounting is a relatively newer standard, only just over 40 countries. And in terms of countries for the ocean specifically, roughly 23 countries. But why ocean accounts? Well, recognizing that oceans are quite difficult to account for, the UN Statistical Division endorsed specific guidance for the oceans. So we at the Global Ocean Accounts Partnership are assisting this process in forming this technical guidance. And so one of our missions is to increase capacity around the world in accounting for ocean areas, but also recognizing coastal areas and land areas adjacent to the ocean as well. As it's important to account for an integrated system. Now, how does ocean accounting link with the different standards? Well, the SEA has a specific guidance for flows within the economy related to wastes, called solid waste accounts. So it considers how much, for example, waste is used for landfill, recycling, or incineration, and what sectors are providing or supplying that waste. Now we can disaggregate this account and look at plastics specifically. But how can we use ocean accounting for the Global Plastics Treaty? Well, we need to understand plastic pollution within the environment, and that's spatial in nature. We need to understand where the plastic is coming from and where it might be going. And we also need to understand the rate of release into the environment. So there's many different sources, as you can see in this image, and we need accounts that look at the different prominent sources, the leakage per sector, for example, and then maybe use that information, the statistics and indicators, to form and evaluate management plans. So ocean accounts can bring together the different standards specifically for the ocean domain. And accounting is quite beneficial because it helps drive knowledge sharing between countries. It builds country capacity in reporting on official statistics, particularly environmental statistics. And it helps measure the dependencies between the environment and the economy, or the economy, impacts of the economy back on to the environment. So when we say plastic-specific accounts, we can take aspects of existing accounts that might exist within countries and then produce a system which tracks plastic-related data across the life cycle. So we could have accounts specifically for production in the domestic sense, consumption by sector and household, the waste generation, and then its subsequent management and treatment, and also the pollution in terms of plastics within the environment. And across this is also imports and exports. So imagine having a modular structure where you can have different buckets, so to say, of accounts which you can incorporate plastics data. And also, hopefully, provide a robust foundation for a lot of the reporting that could be used for the plastics treaty. And so what are the challenges when compiling data? So if few countries know their data availability, what are the challenges with regards to data and the data availability needed to report on treaty measures? Well, for plastics and environmental data particularly, but for plastics, data are fragmented. There's very few national data sets that are centralized within one body. They're usually fragmented across a variety of stakeholders. So for example, the trade statistics could be held within the customs office. Maybe academia has data on plastics within the environment, or potentially the environmental department as well. And then in terms of waste data at the municipality level, that could be held again by another institution. There's also a challenge with plastic-containing products. So it's quite difficult to track these plastics through the economy, and particularly finished goods and packaging. So what do I mean by this? Now take, for example, a water bottle. Maybe the statistics for that water bottle in terms of trade are reported in a monetary value or dollar value, and maybe not in weight. So the amount of weight of that good imported or exported. Or if we did have the weight value, how can we untangle how much was water and how much was the packaging, the plastic bottle? And now that was a fairly simplistic good, but think about a more complex item, such as, for example, an office chair. So many of us might be sitting on office chairs at the moment, and that is composed of metal, for example, those levers, but a lot of it will be composed of plastics. So the cover, the foam underneath that cover, the base might be hard plastic. So how do we start untangling how much plastic are in these more complex goods? So again, how can we get the statistics we need to describe how much plastic is going into landfill, recycling, or energy recovery? And one thing that is particularly challenging is we don't really understand how much is going into the environment in terms of rate. So what's the state of plastic-focused accounts or data? And so there are early efforts. So for example, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have an early estimate of the different flows of plastics, as you can see here. The different colors represent the confidence in the estimate. And you can see the dotted arrows show the release into the environment. So there's a lot of question marks in terms of how much is being lost from sectors into the environment. And so just to give you an example, these are the waste accounts from Australia in 2019. And this is for plastics specifically. So they estimated that 1.2 million tons came from households and 1.34 tons came from the aggregated amount across industrial sectors. And so that's 2.55 million tons of plastics produced in that year. And then they could estimate how much was going to landfill, recycling, and energy recovery. And other countries have produced accounts, waste accounts, some which have disaggregated or separated the specific plastic component in their waste account. Thank you very much. And I'll now hand over to my colleague, Dr. Randika.
Thank you very much, Jordan. I am now going to go through the plastic life cycle from the extraction and conversion of chemicals to plastic to production of products and the consumption all the way to the end of life when it becomes waste. So I'm going to use this plastic life cycle as a guidance to talk about the different data categories. So the first is production. In production, we are looking at domestic primary plastic, that is primary plastics produced within a country. And this could actually provide a baseline for plastic material entering the economy. We are then looking at domestic plastic products, which are plastic products manufactured within the country. And this can help us understand the conversion of primary plastic into the product. Next is the consumption. We are looking at consumption of virgin primary plastic by various sectors within a country, and this provides insight into demand for new plastics. Then we are looking at plastic consumed, the recycled plastics that are used for different products within different sectors. This could be useful for assessing effectiveness of recycling programs and circular economy within the economy. The next category is the trade statistics. We are looking at import and export of primary plastics. Primary plastics that are imported to the country or exported from the country, and that indicates dependency on foreign raw materials and role in global supply chain. And same way, we are looking at the import and export of plastic products. Next in the data checklist is plastic waste. Now, when we look at plastic waste, it's the total amount of plastic waste generated within a country. And this helps us to understand the scale of plastic waste and planning waste management strategies. Plastic waste treatment has different components within that. So the first one is once the plastic waste is generated, how much plastic waste actually collected for management. And then from the collected materials, how much plastic waste is recovered for recycling or even for upcycling. And then how much plastic waste are directed for waste to energy or co-processing. And then plastic waste incinerated, but without energy recovery. And then the last data category is plastic waste landfill. How much plastic waste is disposed of in a landfill. Then we look at, after the treatment, we look at plastic waste trade. How much plastic waste is imported into the country to understand the international flows of plastic waste, and how much plastic waste exported from the country to assess the country's role in global waste management and impact on international waste flows. Then one of the most important areas, environmental leakage, how much plastic is in the environment. So this will look at the plastic waste that ends up in the environment, including land, water bodies, and coastal areas. and assess environmental impact of plastic pollution and developing strategies. This is another data point: informal and other activities, informal waste collection and handling, plastic waste managed through informal sectors. This is a difficult area to collect data, but it's very important, especially in the global south, where there's an active informal sector working in the plastic waste management. Now, what are the implications for INC 5?
And so let's just start off with a common foundation in terms of the UNEA resolution. What does it actually say? And so at the UNEA Assembly in March 2022, there was a resolution adopted to develop an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, including in the marine environment. And so it requested the executive director of UNEP to convene an intergovernmental negotiating committee, or INC. And that committee is responsible for developing the instrument. And so one of the key things in terms of the treaty scope is that the resolution called for a full life cycle of plastic. And just so that we can think about what are the components of this life cycle, we can organize it into the production and consumption, the use of the product, the generation of waste, and then the subsequent management of that waste, and then the release of plastics into the environment. So it's the flow from all the way from natural inputs into the economy, and then also leaving the economy as waste into the environment, also known as plastic pollution. And so this treaty, there's a potential inclusion, implementation, or action plans of many different measures. So we may have seen talk about production reduction targets, the increased use of recyclates or recycled materials. How do we implement these measures through funding? There's talk about product labeling, EPR, extended producer responsibility, all the way downstream as well. How do we monitor the pollution of plastic and better understand where it comes from and where it goes? And also supply chain transparency and reduce subsidies for plastics as well. So a lot of different things being discussed, but hopefully you can agree with me that data is really needed to measure and manage progress to anything that we agree upon. But at the moment, there's not that much focus yet on data. And without national data or the data systems or the pathways to develop these systems over time, that will really impact any country's ability to establish realistic but yet ambitious goals for the reduction and improved management of plastics. It'll reduce the ability to monitor and evaluate progress towards these potential commitments. And it'll also hinder the effort to evaluate global progress and the collective achievements of the global community towards these goals. And finally, if you don't have a data system or national data in place, it'll be difficult to report on progress in a timely, representative, and coherent manner. And I want to bring to your attention a precautionary tale from the SDGs, particularly SDG 14. So the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was adopted back in 2015, almost 10 years ago. And they had a really ambitious target of, by 2025, to prevent and significantly reduce marine pollutions of all kinds. And so there was an indicator for plastic debris density specifically, which was conceptually clear in 2020, with further guidance produced in 2021. But to date, few countries have reported on this indicator. So it's almost been a decade. So what are the implications for not having robust data and data systems for the plastics treaty? Well, most countries have yet to assess the state of their data mapped to the life cycle that I mentioned earlier. And hopefully we're starting to think that national systems will be critical for treaty implementation. And it really begins with an understanding per country of the state of data and data infrastructure related to plastics and waste. And so my three key messages for you today are that this treaty really provides an opportunity to bring stakeholders together and centralize that data needed, the plastics data needed, to report on progress or the state of plastics within a country. To do this, we need to describe the entire life cycle. And at the moment, that's fragmented across stakeholders or unavailable. So to understand what's there and how we can bring it together, we need to understand data availability. And finally, if we compile accounts with what we have, then we can produce a system to report on the plastics treaty and iteratively develop that over time to increase capacity and increase ambition over time.
The data is key for a robust and ambitious treaty to deliver on addressing the plastic pollution. But at the same time, we have to make sure that there is flexibility for countries. Not all countries have access to all the data that they need. So not to actually weaken the ambitious targets, but also at the same time have flexibility for countries to collect data and report the data. So what are the key takeaways for INC 5? Data will be central to building an enduring, ambitious, effective, and equitable global regime. The final treaty text should recognize that countries are starting from different points and have different capabilities. Current data gaps should not be locked into the design of the treaty. There should be a direction of travel and improvement for transparency, reporting, and requirements as data capacities increase. The final treaty text providing for the means of implementation, capacity building, finance, and tech transfer should ensure countries can access support and share lessons learned on building national data infrastructure to improve transparency over time.
I think one final question for you both, in terms of what would be your ideal outcome from INC 5 to really secure data within the future regime? How can the treaty really help us solve some of these data gaps that, Jordan, I think you mentioned?
So in the first instance, INC 5, one of the key outcomes would be a treaty. That would be the first and foremost, but a treaty informed by realistic but ambitious goals. And as we already mentioned across this webinar, hopefully that's founded on data, and not just any data, but data that's centralized, has standardized classifications, and can really help measure in a way that is equitable to different countries. And so those key components I just mentioned, it'd be flexible and equitable, it'd be quantifiable in terms of having quantifiable targets and measuring towards those targets. And I mean, this was more of a stretch, but if we could have specific language in that treaty that looks at data and structured data, in addition to data systems, that would be ideal, at least in my opinion.
Totally agree with you, Jordan. I think at the end of the INC 5, I hope that we can finalize the treaty and that we can actually start working towards these ambitious goals from the start of next year. It's a big task, but I hope that countries can come together and finalize the treaty, and INC 5 will be the last meeting, and that we'll have a finalized text towards the end of this year.
Thank you both so much. Balancing pragmatism with ambition. Thank you again so much for spending your morning or afternoon with us.